Tell you a little bit about our presenter. He has served as director for Murray State University's Outdoor Recreation Program, and he's played a major role in Murray State's sustainability efforts. And in 2017, he received the Excellence in Teaching Award from the National Society of Leadership and Success. And he is also host, which I just love this, he's also host for WKMS Music from the Front Porch. Let's welcome Mike.
Thank you, Bobby, and thank you, Meredith. Thank you to the McCracken County Library for hosting these Zoom sessions during our quite interesting times. Hopefully this presentation will help you possibly either refine your skills in hiking or backpacking, or afford you the opportunity to explore something new. I won't read from the PowerPoints to you, but I did provide quite a few PowerPoints for your reference. When this is over, it will be recorded, and then you can go back, and if you have any questions past our question and answer time, you can use these PowerPoint slides to prompt to help you find things on the internet. There is a plethora of information out there. I'll try to point out some that may not be as beneficial as others. You can't believe everything on the internet, so we will cover that. What I want to do is a couple of things with this presentation. One, I want to introduce you to what hiking and backpacking is. Two, the most important part is that if you want to start hiking or backpacking, is that you can identify the risks associated with it and you can do it safely. And then I'd also like to make sure that you consider the environmental ethics that go along with being a responsible steward in the outdoors. And then I would like to connect you to some of the benefits that we don't typically think of first when it comes to backpacking and hiking. So if you have any questions, type them up in chat. If I can't get to them during the presentation, I'll come back to them at the end. And so basically, we'll start off by saying with that hiking is a state of mind, if you will. It is an immersion in the out of doors. We typically, when we are in an urban setting, we're hiking or we're walking, we're on a sidewalk, we're walking our dog. The difference with hiking is that we're immersed in nature. We are on a trail that may be rocky, it may be sandy, there may be scree. We may be in the elements where there's rain or high humidity or snow or any of those things. And we may also have birds or wildlife or sunsets or other things, wildflowers that we're also engaged with that pique our senses when we're out there. So it is different than walking and the hearing the honking of cars and things of that nature. So one of the reasons that a lot of people get into backpacking or hiking is to basically disengage themselves from all the stimuli in an urban setting. So we remove ourselves from our phone, from text messages, from messengers, and all of those things. Another one is to become more in contact with our ecosystems and our natural environment, which often helps us to define ourselves. We connect with our role in the much greater ecosystem. It allows us to forget some of our egocentric problems for a minute, and it allows us to fully focus on the things around us. We may also get into the backcountry because it is physically rigorous and we enjoy it, and it helps us develop physically, whether it be strength or endurance or perseverance or our ability to endure pain. I know that may sound kind of funny, but there are some what we might call sadistic backpackers that do it, that suffer and that take pictures of the blisters on their feet or what have you. So there are a multitude of motivations for getting into the backcountry, but a lot of times it's to disconnect. The benefits for hiking and backpacking are not only physical. It will improve your musculoskeletal system. It will allow you to relax and reduce stress through physical exertion, but it will also help you build self-esteem and self-efficacy by learning new skills, by learning new plants and animal species, by understanding more about the ecosystem's relationships with one another, the environmental ethics skills. You may learn how to tie new knots. It will be intellectually stimulating in other ways. You may learn the natural history of the natives of the area where you do backpacking and hiking. So there are a lot of different things that we go to the backcountry for. One of the basic things that we have to do when we go into the backcountry is make sure that we consider everything that we need to reduce our risks that keep us safe. And we'll talk about those a lot during this presentation. And so we'll continue to come back to say, always manage your risk, always weigh the risk before you commit to something, whether it be a stream crossing or going around a snake or other things that are similar to those scenarios. So we always want to err on the side of precaution. One of the things about traveling in the backcountry is we want to be able to do it another time. So we have to come home from this trip to be able to do it again. So one of the basic things is when we start to travel in the backcountry, if we haven't been to the areas where we're going to hike or where we're going to backpack, we need to know about those areas. And so there are a few ways that trails are rated. One, they're basically the terrain is rated easy, moderate, and then the last one is either technical or strenuous. Now, it may take you a little bit of a few times to go hiking to see how different trails are rated. It is subjective. So if you have a naturalist that's been an avid backpacker for 40 years, what he defines as moderate may be strenuous or technical for a beginner. So you want to err on the side of caution when you think in those terms. You also want to consider your physical fitness. The three basic things that we look at are your strength, your endurance, and your flexibility. And that comes with traveling over rugged terrain. But we also want to consider if we have any conditions that might make us more vulnerable in the backcountry. Do we have high blood pressure? Do we have allergies that may cause extreme risk in the backcountry? Are we allergic to native flora or fauna in the areas that we're going to? So we want to make sure that we do the research, and we'll talk about how we do that research when we get to planning a trip. So we'll go a little bit more in depth in that. But we want to start out by saying that, one, we want to be honest in our abilities, our physical strengths and weaknesses, so that we can accurately estimate what we're able to do to keep us safe. The benefits of wilderness travel are almost limitless. Obviously, the physical health is one of the best things. It will improve cardiovascular health. It will improve our flexibility. It will improve our strength. It will improve our endurance. It will improve, sometimes it will improve our observation, our hearing, or our sight. We'll learn to look at something longer, so we might see smaller movements than we normally do. It will also improve our mental health by stimulating us intellectually. When we learn new flowers and when we learn new animals, or we may recognize habitats that we didn't recognize before, or signs, or even scat, which is another word for animal poop. When we start to recognize those things, we engage our intellect, and then we oftentimes are inspired to learn more. When we come home from the trail, we may go on the internet, or we may go to the library and get field guides and reach out and learn more information. It will also help us reduce stress. Things are much slower in the backcountry. We have taken out all those things. We've taken out the boss's phone calls. We've taken out the kids. Well, if you take your kids, occasionally there might be some children's stress in the wilderness as well. But we take out all of those things that kind of distract us from the very simple things, which is basically engaging our body physically, nourishing ourselves, getting rest, and enjoying our environment or our surroundings. So it really is a way to recharge. It's adaptive restoration, if you will. Once we remove ourselves from those stimuli that overwhelm us, we're able to get in touch with the things that help us heal. It will also help our self-esteem and self-efficacy. As we learn new skills, as we gain new information intellectually, we gain confidence. We go farther into the wilderness. We engage in new wilderness settings. We may go winter backpacking. We may go to desert environments. So it allows us to improve our confidence, where we'll reach out and do more things. It also engages us in a bit of value clarification. And what I mean by that is it allows us to think of what's important to us. You know, when we talk later about environmental ethics, some people may not think of how we dispose of our waste in the wilderness being very important because it'll be biodegradable. But when we think about what occurs in the ecosystem, that might change how we value what we choose to do in our interactivity with an ecosystem. So it'll allow us to think more about ourselves. It'll also allow us to think what's important to us. You know, is it being in nature? Is it work? A lot of times I will go for a hike in the wilderness to think through a problem. It'll allow me to think about those values and lay everything out in my mind to be able to better make a decision. It will also allow us to engage creatively with nature. A couple of things I'm going to talk about later is some things that we can do to make sure that we get the most out of our experiences. But one of the cool things about outdoor recreation and backpacking and hiking and wilderness experience is research shows that those attachments to those positive experiences get stronger over time. So when we have a meaningful experience and we see that most excellent sunset, or we saw a bald eagle grab a fish off the water and we were just overwhelmed with awe, when we're able to journal and take those things down, those things get stronger over time, and it becomes extremely important to carry those things forward. I've been taking wilderness trips for a long time, and I find that when I go back to my journals, that those experiences come back in much fuller perspective. So we'll talk about some of those as well as we get started and go through how that we can be further engaged with remembering and learning and interacting with the ecosystem in a non-impactful way. So a couple of things, we're going to go through some areas, the basics of how we get started doing these things and what we're going to need to keep us safe and help us to interact with our ecosystems in an environmentally thoughtful way. So one of the things I want to explain, this is introduced as hiking and backpacking. I'm going to talk mostly about backpacking, but hiking is basically a backpacking trip that is not overnight. It is a day trip where you're going out and then you're coming back. So you don't need to most likely carry a stove and a cookable meal. You don't need to carry your shelter or your sleeping bag or those things on the trip. With hiking, it's much simpler. You're planning for a day. There will still be some of the similar considerations, environmental exposure to ticks and mosquitoes or poison ivy, proper hydration, reducing sun exposure for heat-related illnesses, or cold exposure for cold-related illnesses. But for the most part, backpacking is the same as hiking. Hiking is just done for one day and you're not living in the backcountry overnight. So we're going to talk about some of the basic equipment. We'll also talk about proper clothing. A lot of people don't recognize the dangers involved with not selecting the proper clothing for the backcountry, and we'll explain that in quite a bit of depth to make sure that you're prepared for all the environments and the exposures that you could face in those environments as weather patterns change or other things occur. We'll also talk about some basic skills. Some of the basic skills, such as food preparation, I will give you a rundown of the basic equipment and explain some risk considerations, but I'll leave it to you to dig deeper on the internet. There are plenty of YouTube videos. There are magazines like Backpacker and related magazines that will offer further instruction. Since this is a fairly short presentation via Zoom, I won't be able to demonstrate lighting a stove and stuff like that. So, but I will go over the basics to make sure that you can find the further knowledge you need when this program's over. The next thing, and this is probably the most important that I'll cover, and it'll be towards the end, but is the basic concepts for wilderness safety. Safety in the backcountry is much more important. Well, let me take that back. It is equally as important as safety in an urban environment, but it comes with much higher risk when something goes wrong. If we have a situation in an urban area, we're close to an ambulance service, we're close to help. In a wilderness setting, not only are we not close to help, but it's much harder to get to us. It's much harder for us to relay where we're at. So we can also be exposed to the elements. So we're going to spend quite a bit of time on some things to be very considerate of in the backcountry to keep us safe. So that's going to be one of the most important things that we look at today. So the basic equipment, obviously you're providing shelter for yourself. So the first thing you're going to need is a tent. I do not want to not acknowledge the fact that a lot of hammock campers exist these days. You can also choose hammocks, but for the basics, I want to stick with tents and the types of tents. But do realize that you can do some research. There are hammock systems that come with tarps and also come with bottom quilts that will provide the same insulation that you could get with a sleeping bag and a sleeping pad. But I want to stick to basically ground camping, if you will, and we're going to talk about tents. So tents are, probably everybody is familiar with tents. One of the things when we talk about any of this equipment for backpacking, I want to explain a few things. One, you don't have to spend a lot of money for any of this equipment. When I started, it was with a borrowed backpack from my uncle. It was a 1970s model that he had in college. It was an external frame Coleman, and I had as much fun with that backpack in the backcountry as I've had with any backpack I've ever owned. So the expense and the weight are not always important, but I do want to give you some ideas of how to decide on your gear. And so one of the things is knowing the environments you're going in. So with tents, the way that we describe tents and their ability to withstand the environment is whether they're a 3 or 4 season tent. So do they operate or are they functional in the fall, spring, summer? And then the 4 season is that they'll be more functional in the winter. And what that means is that they're basically able to be constructed or set up in a way that keeps more elements out in much colder temperatures, high winds, snow, or stuff like that. But so you'll select the tents accordingly. The other thing you'll do is select them based on size. You have the smallest tent, which is a bivy tent, which is basically one person. You can't really get any gear in a bivy tent. You would want to have a pack cover for your pack, and it would stay outside your tent. And then they go up from there. It's 1 person, 2 person, 3 person, 4 person, and now you can buy 6-room tents that look like little city halls. So there are a lot of those. When selecting a tent, you want to consider the environment and what seasons you'll be using it. And then you want to go back to some of those things that we talked about your physical abilities, your strength, your endurance. If you're going to carry a tent, you want to think that you're going to carry it for each step on that backpacking trip. So weight does become important when you're planning the distance, you're planning the technical difficulty of your terrain, and also you're planning on what type of tent you want to buy based on weight. So that's going to be another thing. Tents come in all different shapes and sizes. Some common ones are dome tents or A-frames, tunnel tents. There are inflatable tents. There's just about any tent design you can imagine on the market. Some of the pole designs are just mind-blowing nowadays and how they set them up and how they've minimized the use of tent poles. There's also freestanding, and that means that they basically, when you set them up, they stay standing. And the ones that aren't freestanding, you will have to actually anchor and tie off. So those will take more practice to operate. But what I would say is that you want to think about what environment you're in, how much weight you're physically able to carry for the distance that you choose or plan on going, and then the size of your group. One of the things when you travel with more than one person, if you're sharing a tent, you can break the tent down into parts and you can share weight. So that oftentimes helps you to reduce the weight so that a member of your group is not overexerted carrying the tent for everyone else. We're going to put all of this stuff in a backpack. In the next slide, I've got a picture that I borrowed from the internet that shows the anatomy of a backpack. There are, once again, 1 million designs of backpacks on the market. There are basically two types that we talk about. Internal frame, which means that the frame of the backpack is actually inside the pack itself, or the fabric part of the pack. And then there's an external frame where the fabric part is attached to that external framework. They both work extremely well. I've used each variety over the last 25 years, 30 years. Currently, the trend is towards internal frame packs. There's different reasons for that, but mostly the trend has been going on for about 15 or 20 years that manufacturers have moved towards what customers desire more, which is the internal frame. The only difference there is how we pack them. Do we put stuff inside or do we attach it onto the pack? So that's basically up to you. You can look at, once again, pricing and weight being the two things that you would want to consider. Also, how long the duration of your trip is going to be. If you're going to go on a 10-day pack, then obviously you're going to need a larger pack to carry more food, more gear, and other things. You might also think about what environment you're in and what your priorities are for being out there. You may want a camera compartment. You may want more external pouches where other gear, your journal or your compass or other things are available to you. And so then you can more strategically pack a pack that has more pockets. We'll talk about, and I'll explain the anatomy in just a minute, but most of them have a brain, which is the top pouch where you might keep your lunch. So depending on what you're out there for, if you're collecting samples and you're an amateur biologist, then you might want more pockets to keep some of those scientific supplies. If you're a painter, you might want specialized pockets for those things. Those packs are available. The most important thing with a pack is its fit. Now, a couple of things about this. Typically, the fit of the backpack is dependent upon your torso length. Now, I'm 6'5", but I know people that are my exact same height that have a 3-inch difference in torso length. So what you're going to want to do is find a professional if you can, or do the research yourself on the internet about appropriate sizing. What I will say to you when you see the anatomy of the backpack is that most models are extremely adaptable. You can make the torso length longer or shorter. You can, the shoulder straps, the hip belt straps, the sternum strap, you can adjust all of those things to adjust the fit. And that's something that is extremely important that you practice and that you learn how to do with the backpack that you choose to buy. But you can get sized at stores like REI, Hooper's, I'm sure will help you find the appropriate fit of backpack. But that's going to be the most important thing. They do make gender-specific backpacks. They do make children's backpacks. So you do want to consider making sure that you get one that is going to be the best fit for you. The better the fit, the less musculoskeletal issues you'll have, less blisters, less shoulder soreness. You'll just be much better off if we have a better fit. We're going to be sleeping in the outdoors on a backpacking trip. So you want to select your bed, which in this case will be a sleeping bag and a sleeping pad. And I also want to mention a sleeping bag liner as we get into cold weather backpacking. There are different types of sleeping bags and sleeping pads. The sleeping bags are typically, they're a mummy bag, which cinches around the head for cold environments. And then we have rectangular bags. And then the type of insulation they have. They may be down natural insulation, which is down feathers. Usually it's goose. They may be a synthetic bag, which is a chemical insulation that's been manufactured. They may have natural feathers that have been treated with a chemical, like a dry down. So the dry is the treating on the down, which will make it stay insulated when it's wet. So that's one of the things you also want to consider is your exposure. If there's a chance that you're in if you're in Washington State and there's much more rainfall, per year, and you may be exposed to heavy showers and it's going to be cool, you're going in the fall or winter, then you want to make sure that you have a sleeping bag that insulates when wet. We'll talk about how heat loss occurs here in a little bit when we talk about clothing, but it also applies to sleeping bags. So we'll need to choose a material that insulates when wet. And also in the backcountry, it's extremely important that we choose materials that dry quickly. The quicker they dry, the more they'll go back to their designed insulating abilities. The next thing we have is a sleeping pad, and those are for comfort. Yes, they are. They're supposed to replicate your mattress to the best of their ability, but they're also to insulate you from the ground. So if it's a very cold backpacking trip, that sleeping pad can be just as important to the insulation and keeping you warm as the sleeping bag is. And those pads are generally inflatable. They may be inflatable with baffles, which provide more heat. And then they may also be a closed cell foam or even just a roll styrofoam pad. I've used all of those. Some of the things you might want to consider when selecting a sleeping pad is, are you a side sleeper or do you sleep on your back? The size and whatever else your specific sleep habits have. Some have wider shoulders, some have wider feet boxes, some have more insulated feet boxes if your feet tend to get especially cold. So you can tailor those things to how you specifically sleep. Another thing you want to consider is length. I'm 6'5". If my sleeping bag is just a little bit too short, then I'm cramped up. My back hurts the next morning. It's going to make the hiking and the carrying of the pack less fun or enjoyable. So you want to make sure that you also get the right length. Those also come in a couple of different varieties. They also are gender specific. If you hike as a couple, you have a partner that you hike with, you can also get compatible sleeping bags that will zip together so that you can still maintain your intimacy in the backcountry setting. They do come with right or left zip, depending on what your preference is, if you're right or left-handed. So there are a lot of differences in your ability to tailor the sleeping bag to your sleeping habits. So you can look online, you could go down the internet rabbit hole and research sleeping bags and any of the other equipment I've talked about for months and months, but you can also use this basic information to buy one that will be suitable for basic backpacking. The other thing is we'll be not taking all the water that we're going to drink on a trip. We will have to filter water in the backcountry. This is probably the most important thing to remaining healthy in the backcountry. Depending on our water source, we can be exposed to all kinds of bacteria, protozoa, and other things that will cause gastrointestinal maladies, and we do not want that. When we get sick in the backcountry, that becomes exponentially more severe than we're sick in an urban setting or even in the front country. So we want to make sure that our drinking water is safe. There's 3 systems that I'm going to talk about. Basically, all of them work really well, but I would say that you need to research the one that works best for your water source. And so what I mean by that is the difference of backpacking in land between the lakes. If we're in an area where we're not going to be able to filter from a stream, we may filter from the lake. There may be more chemical contamination than if we're filtering from a stream on the Appalachian Trail. So we would want a filter that filters out those chemicals as well. Not all filters do that, but some do. So you want to make sure that you know what is in the water source for the areas that you're traveling so that you can get the appropriate water filtration or treatment. And so let's talk about filtration. There are two types of well, let me take that back. There are three ways that we treat our water or we filter it to get rid of these things. One is water filtration. Typically, those are carbon filters. Those can be hand pumped. They also make gravity filters. We have things now like life straws and other things. So there are a lot of different filtration devices. You can get, in a group setting, I'll use a 4-liter a gravity filter that doesn't require much work or much pumping, but it might be a little slower. If it's just you and you're doing an individual backpacking trip, you might be able to use a hand pump filter, and that'll work well for you. But you want to consider the duration of your trip, how much water you're going to need, which will be based on air temperature and exertion, and we'll talk about that a little bit more later, and decide accordingly. Another way we can treat water is through tablets, iodine tablets, water treatment tablets. Those typically kill living organisms, but they won't do anything for chemical treatments or for the chemicals in our water. So once again, you might want to do the research to understand the source of your water. And then another thing that kills some of those living organisms is ultraviolet light. And so they have basically ultraviolet light that you stick a little wand in, and then that will kill all the living things in your water. Those vary in price, in size, and in the amount of water that they can filter or treat at a time. And then if you do have a water source that does not have chemical contamination, you can also boil your water before drinking or cooking with it. So we can boil water to kill all those living organisms. But if we do that, we want to make sure that we bring it to a roving boil for at least 3 minutes to make sure that we kill those. We want to err on the side of precaution. So you may, if you're keeping time, you may want to go just a little bit longer than that. Also, since we're living in the outdoors, we're going to have to cook our meals out there. Now, in the backcountry setting, when we were backpacking, typically we cook breakfast and dinner. A couple of reasons for that. One is we're on the move during the day, so we want to limit the time that we're spending cooking lunch. So generally that will be bagels and hummus, or tuna out of a pack, or what have you, things like that. But another reason why we cook for breakfast and dinner is those two meals are extremely important. One, the nutrition to fire up our metabolism for the day, to give us energy for the strenuous exercise of backpacking is extremely important. So oftentimes it's important to cook a big hearty meal for breakfast to set our metabolism straight for the day. Excuse me. And second, another reason is for thermal control. If we wake up in a winter backpacking setting, we'll want to cook a warm breakfast. One of the things that I do, and I've told my students to do over the years, one of the tricks of the trade, if you will, is that you have your stove and your water ready, and the first thing you do before getting out of your sleeping bag is you make a warm drink. That's going to warm you up. That's going to make you much more prepared to greet the day, to get out and cook breakfast, to make a warm breakfast. So that's going to help us regulate our temperature as well. So we'll consider that for the breakfast and dinner meal. The thing with the dinner meal is another thermal regulation thing. We want to cook a warm meal, so that will help our metabolism. It will also allow us to be a little warmer. Two, we're going to need a hearty meal. We'll talk about nutrition and basic nutrition, and why we plan our protein, our carbohydrates, and our fats per meal. But one of the things with the evening meal, we cook a big dinner. Usually it has a good source of protein. This protein is what helps our body recover overnight. It's how our muscles repair themselves. So we're going to stagger our nutrients based on what we need them for the day or for the night. We'll talk about stoves really quickly. There are a lot of different stove types. I'll go with the one that I don't utilize very much, and it's not that I don't encourage it. I just find it to be simpler not to use them. But an alcohol stove, you're lighting alcohol on fire. They work well, but we can't necessarily control the heat or temper the heat very well. Also, when we have gas, liquid gas like white gas or alcohol, we take the chance of spilling it or contaminating our pack, or if we spill it and we lose it, then we don't have that fuel for the rest of our trip. But they can be efficient. They're also effective. I'm not trying to discourage that, but in my experience, I found it much easier to use one of the other two types. And so the second type that's just a little bit more involved to operate is a white gas stove. And so this is a stove that has liquid white gas that you're going to pump into the stove, and then you're going to basically use that gas. You'll prime that stove, you'll light it, and you'll cook there. One of the reasons for using white gas, one, it's a little less bulky. You can just carry it in whatever size container you need for the duration of your trip or the amount you're going to cook. Two, it works much better in extreme cold environments. If we get into winter backpacking where we get below freezing, white gas will always work and always be effective. Now, the stove that's most simplest for the beginning backpacker is an ISOPRO or a propane stove. These are very, very small, extremely lightweight. I use what's called a pocket rocket. It's about, it's basically, when I pack it away, it's about 3 inches by 1.5 inches, a little container. It's extremely small. You screw that on top of an ISOPRO canister that you can get at Hooper's or REI or other places like that. Those are extremely efficient. They work extremely well, and they're extremely simple. Now, a few things about cooking in the backcountry. One thing is that sanitation is extremely important. As I said before, gastrointestinal illnesses take on a much more significant imperative in the backcountry, because if we become dehydrated or we become nauseous, we're in more trouble than we would be if we were at home and we could run down to the store and get whatever medication that will reduce those symptoms. So we have to be careful not to cross-contaminate. We also have to be careful to cook everything to temperature. We want to make sure that it comes to a boil, that we cook meat thoroughly if we're cooking meat or eggs or stuff like that. So we want to make sure that we do that. The next most important thing about safety and stoves is that we're very careful. When we're cooking in the backcountry and we're using a very small stove, we have it setting on maybe an uneven surface. There may be wind. We may be doing other things. We maybe have the pots a little bit bigger than the stove, so it may not be balanced perfect. So we want to be extremely careful with boiling water, with hot foods. We want to make sure that we are protecting ourselves. We're not knocking the stove over. We're not doing other things that might endanger us. We don't want to burn our hands. So you want to have a glove, or you want to have you might want to utilize a piece of clothing so that you're not burning your hands in the backcountry. So we want to be very cognizant of those things. A burn on your stove at the house, not a big deal. But in the backcountry, if it blisters, the blister pops open, it gets infected, it may ruin a trip. So those are things that we want to consider when we're thinking about the safety and the precaution of cooking. One last thing, our cooking supplies are the materials. We have to consider the weight and the type of material. Those can be based on size, just like anything else we've discussed, because of the duration of your trip or the number of members in your group. So those are available in all different kinds of varieties, utensils. Some people bake in the backcountry. There are French presses made for the backcountry. So you can get as in-depth as you want to, or as simple as you want to. And I'll explain when we get to the nutrition portion of this program. I'll give you some more tips and ideas about formulating a menu and things you might want to consider to make your trip either more simple or more luxurious. So it'll be up to you. And then the last thing is we want to make sure that we know where we're going. Now, what I would encourage beginners to do is stay on designated trails and defined trails, trails that the connectors are marked good, that you know your route, get advice, bring a trail map. But you also want to be able to use a compass. I don't need you to be able to read a map per se, but it's extremely important to know which direction is which and to be able to orient a compass to true north so that you can figure out to go east to hit the trail or west to hit the trail. Um, but you don't necessarily have to read a topographic map. That's not something that a beginning backpacker has to do. But if you're not going to do that, then you want to make sure that you know the trail. It's easy to recognize. Most trails that you hike on backpacking, the designated trails will be marked by what we call blazes. Those will be 6 foot, around eye level, a little higher, marked on trees. You'll want to make sure to follow those. You'll want to know what the blaze colors for your trails are. What are the connector blazes? You'll want to do a little bit of research on, how far the distances from trailhead to intersection or connector is so that you can judge distance. Judging distance for a beginning backpacker is a peace of mind thing. Typically, it takes us longer to get to where we're going than we think it does. But if you know what you're looking for, you will be less stressed that you've missed a turn or you didn't hit that connector or you didn't miss the campsite. So try to orient yourself with the trail map and the directions that you'll be going prior to going backpacking. Same with hiking. You'll want to make sure that you're able to do those things. And so those are the basic equipments that you're looking at. You don't need much more than those basic things. The other things that we'll talk about a little bit later would be kind of luxuries, if you will. As we get into different things like camp chairs that you can use your sleeping pad and fold it up into a chair. But these are the basics to get you out onto the trail into nature. In this next slide, we have the basic anatomy of a hiking backpack. I won't dwell too much on the anatomy other than to say you can recognize all the straps on these backpacks. They're compression straps, there's shoulder straps, there's a hip belt, there's a sternum strap. All of these things are made to help the backpack fit better and be more efficient for you to carry. So whatever backpack you buy, you want to experiment with those. You also are going to need to experiment with how your body handles weight. We all have different body types. We all have different physical abilities, strengths and weaknesses. Being tall, that makes it different for someone that's 5'6" and much more muscular than I am. So I would have to configure my pack differently. These are all things that are individual preferences and exploration to dial them in for you. Now, a couple of things that I will explain about a pack, and this is something that different people agree or disagree upon, so I'm going to give you some ideas and allow you to make some of those judgments for yourself. But two of the most important things about a backpack: one is the size. We've got to make sure it fits. But the next thing is, when we're packing it, we want to think of keeping it symmetrical, both horizontal and vertical. We want it to be symmetrical. We don't want one side to be much heavier and it be riding on our right hip. Anytime that backpack is unbalanced, that's causing issues when we walk. We're carrying that for thousands of steps a day, and over time, that asymmetry will throw us off. It'll cause your back to hurt. It'll pull on your shoulders. It will make you sore. So we want to make sure that we work on making the weight symmetrical, both vertically and horizontally. Now, a couple of ideas when we think about packing the pack. There are different schools of thought, but I'll explain a couple. One is, and this is kind of an old school thought, but when we carry white gas or we have an alcohol stove, or if, in an alpine setting, we have to carry out our urine or something like that, we want to keep anything that might spill on the rest of our belongings, that might soil them, on the bottom. We would keep those where they cannot soil the rest of our pack. And then we would pack on top of that accordingly. Now, another thing that we would do is we're going to put things that we utilize least on the bottom. So typically our sleeping bag, our tent are going to go towards the bottom of our bag. Same with our cook sets, because we'll be done using those at breakfast. We won't get them back out until the end. But we're going to need to keep our clothing towards the top. We'll need to keep our snacks and our lunch towards the top. We'll want to keep our journal or our camera or our sunglasses or all of those other things towards the top. So we want to make sure that we're thinking as far as efficiency. What am I going to use? Are we planning on fishing, after 3 miles? Well, I want to keep my fishing pole on the outside of my pack and strap it there. So you'll want to really think about what you want out of your trip and then pack your bag accordingly. Now, a couple of other considerations that you might want to think about is when we start thinking about our terrain, if we're doing a lot of elevation gain, a lot of climbing and a lot of descending, a lot of times it's better for us physically to keep the heavier weight lower on our hips. When we put something heavy in the top of our pack towards the brain, we have to keep that very tight, but if we lean back or we lean sideways, that weight being on the top will be much more likely to help us, or let me take that back, to cause us to lose our balance. So if we're going to be doing that, we want to keep the weight over our muscles, over our hips, so that it's mostly on our legs, and we'll have much more control of the weight of the pack. And so we'll put lighter things on top. So we'll want to take that into consideration as well. As you'll notice on this pack, there are pockets on the side of the hip belt. Be strategic. That might be where your rain jacket goes. If a thunderstorm comes out of nowhere in the afternoon and you're hiking in Colorado, boom, your rain jacket and your pack cover are both right there. You can do that. So whatever it may be, if you're allergic to something, that might be where you keep your EpiPen or your Benadryl or other things. So just think about what kind of trips you're going to be taking, what kind of issues you may have, or what kind of terrain you may be in, and then start to have some fun with strategically working with your pack to make it perfect for your trip. Because all of these things can be done based on your personality, your style, and what you enjoy about backpacking. So don't limit yourself to what you found on one website, but take these things into consideration and then use your best judgment and then practice. Your first backpacking trip will not be perfect. You will learn from things like, oh, that really didn't set well, that hurt my hip. Then you'll change where you position that in your pack the next trip or the next day even. I encourage students to repack every day and make sure that they're refining how the pack fits, where the stuff sits, and how it feels. So you can tailor that to your preference and to your body type. So always experiment with what's the most comfortable for you as far as wearing your pack and how it's tightened. You'll also notice in this diagram is the compression straps on the side, which will keep your gear tighter against your body or looser. Generally, a rule of thumb is to keep it tighter because your body's able to control it better. It won't flop around. It won't slide around in the pack. As I said, you'll keep your balance better, but you can just adjust those compression straps to refine how you carry your load. Then that can become extremely important as far as comfort and everything else goes as well. The next thing, you want to practice setting up your tent. There are so many tents, so many different configurations, but every single tent that you buy, or even one that you buy new, or that if you buy one off eBay, the greatest thing about the internet is a Google search will allow you to probably find the original instruction booklet for that tent. That will show you exactly how to set it up, how to attach it to the ground tarp or the footprint, where the poles go, are there pole connectors, how do they fit. Also, depending on if it's, rainy or windy, it might show you how to adjust the guy lines to tighten it down for less exposure at the bottom, or to loosen it so that you get more airflow in a hot climate. So you want to practice that tent, understand how it works. One of the things that I typically do in warm weather backpacking is I'll leave the rain fly off if it's not terribly humid to allow for more airflow. With that said, I better know how to put that rain fly on extremely quickly if a storm comes up out of nowhere. And I've had this happen to me numerous times. I'm sleeping soundly after a long day in the backcountry, and oh no, here comes a thunderstorm, and I'm trying to get out of the tent and get the rain fly on as quick as possible. So you do want to practice, you do want to become familiar with your tent setup, and that's easy to do. Now, another thing, and you don't have to be an expert not tire. You don't have to be a former sailor to do things in the backcountry, but you can learn some really simple knots that will help you do things when things go wrong. So if you break a grommet on your tent, you can use a clove hitch to tie it to your tent pole. If you lost something, you could use a shoestring and girth hitch it to reattach something as a guy line to your tent. So you can look on YouTube. For me to explain all these knots would take up too much time in a basic course or a basic Zoom session, but you can easily find those. There's thousands of examples on YouTube for each one of those knots I mentioned. There are other knots you can explore as you get more into backpacking, so you can make sure that you understand that. So in cooking, there are a few things that we want to think of as well. One, safe stove use, as I've said before, is the balance on uneven terrain, which is extremely important. The storage of your fuels, also keeping our fuels away from our campfires or other things that we may have, not dropping them on rocks. The pressurized, the ISOPro under pressure can also be dangerous. The next thing is, if we use white gas, you want to be extremely careful when you're priming those. You want to make sure that if it doesn't light immediately, that you want to step back and you want to take a few minutes to allow that excess stove fuel. And this is even true on the ISOPro. When you turn that open and you hear that and you try to light it and you didn't get it lit, turn it off and let that gas dissipate. Because if you do that and you leave it going and you're trying to light and the more gas you've let out, there's a chance that you light it and then all that gas is going to blow up into your face, and then it becomes dangerous. So if you don't get the stove lit on the first try, allow that excess gas to dissipate to make it safe to light again. We never utilize any of the stoves that we talked about in a tent or anywhere that there's not airflow. We can asphyxiate ourselves. We can become sick from the carbon monoxide. We don't want to poison ourselves, so we want to be extremely, extremely careful. Another thing I said, you want to always protect your hands. You don't want to burn yourself, and I'm guilty of this millions of times. You put a lid, you're trying to boil water, and you don't use your little handle grabber, and I'll take my fingers and I'll pull that lid off because I think I'm tough, and then all my fingerprints will be burned off for the next 6 weeks or what have you. So you want to be very, very careful when you're utilizing stoves and when you're dealing with boiling water. A lot of times we're using instant things that we rehydrate with hot water. I don't like to pour boiling water into someone else's cup. I don't like to hold my own cup when I'm pouring it in. I'll put it between two rocks. I'll make where it's stable, and then I'll pour it in. But boiling water can cause third-degree burns, which can become extremely dangerous in the backcountry. So we want to make sure that we take every precaution we can when dealing with hot water or hot food in the backcountry. And the next one is getting more enjoyment out of our hiking. This is where the creativity and the intellectual stimulation comes in. But I make it a point for my students and for myself to think a little bit differently than I would in an urban setting or the front country, to stop and kind of recognize why I'm out there. And I'll just give you a few tips for doing that and why I do it. And you can take these tips, and then creativity is yours, and you can do all kinds of different things. But one, you want to remember the smaller things. A lot of times in an urban setting, we get caught up with the big things, and we see the car, but we don't see the insects. Same way in the backcountry. So we want to do things that slow us down and help us observe things more. And so some of the things that I use when teaching a group to journal, or when we stop and we have lunch, we'll take some quiet time to kind of get in tune with the area. One of the ones I do is I have students make a fist and close their eyes. And every time they hear a sound, one finger comes open. After 5 sounds, open your eyes and see if you can identify what made those sounds. Which bird made that sound that I heard first? Was that a cricket or was that a toad? Those things. And then you can journal about that. Oh, it wasn't that bird that I thought it was. It was a different one. And as you do that, you start to have this collection of information over the years and over the days you're on a trip. Another one, and this has been great with the advent of cell phones, which have great cameras and makes this much easier, because I'm not very good at drawing, but people that are artistic, I'll often have them draw 3 plants that they've never seen before and then go back and identify them. But people that can't draw can take those pictures on their cell phone and just write down when they took the picture and find that back on their cell phone, and then print those out and utilize those for their journal. Come back, and if you want to learn the scientific name for that flower or that plant, then you can do that. But it will help you become more immersed in the area that you're in. I teach a rock climbing class out at Fern Cliff, and my favorite thing is their journaling is to find 5 wildflowers and identify them. And there's so many wildflower species that they'll come up with 25 different varieties out of 10 kids. And so it's just amazing to share that information. So you can start to accumulate that amateur naturalist information the longer you do those things. Another thing is to look for things that are abnormal. We do a lot of backpacking around here. A lot of trips are taken in LBL. As you know, LBL was settled before it became a recreation area. So you might find an old cistern, or you might find the daylilies, or you might find certain things that are not native to the place, but that will help you identify some of the natural history. You might see old fence posts, or you might see certain things. I mean, you come across chimneys. But so explore and see what the place was before you did your trips there. Set some goals for your journaling to help you remember the things that are important to you. You might write down how you felt about the sunrise or the sunset. What was your favorite part of the day? What was your favorite part of this spot? Did you try something new cooking? What would you do differently? But allow those things to guide you to help your journal be more in depth and more connected to what you want to get out of the trip. Now we're going to talk a little bit about your well-being again, and this is how we choose our clothing. We want to think of the materials. Typically, we're more exposed to the elements, so we're going to use things that are warm. They also have to stay warm when wet. Cotton, denim, those things do not stay warm when they're wet, so we want to choose wool, and now there are a lot of synthetic materials. We also want to reduce the ability for our body heat to dissipate in cold temperatures through convection, which means losing it to the wind, conduction, which is losing it to another surface. We're outdoors, so we have more exposure. And then we might want to reduce the radiation exposure where we get sunburn or we increase our heat. That could be the color of clothing that we choose. In cold climates, we want things to be windproof and waterproof, which will reduce our heat loss. In warm environments, we might want to choose materials that actually do draw evaporation more quickly. So we might choose cotton in a desert setting, which will keep us more cool. We want to layer our clothing. We want to choose a base layer, a mid layer, and an outer layer. So basically the reason for this is as we change temperature based on exertion, we can remove or add a layer so that our body temperature doesn't change very rapidly, which could cause some issues, hypothermia or other things. And then we might have a shell, which keeps our stuff dry and keeps the wind off of us. I'm gonna run through basically the leave no trace principles. we want to plan ahead and prepare. And I'm actually going to jump ahead a slide to see that. But you want to know your group and your route. You want to know the experience, strengths and weaknesses, all of the things here. Then you're going to plan accordingly to that information. You choose a trip that everyone can handle. You're going to think of all the risks that might occur based on the things in A, and you're going to plan for that. You're going to plan for the terrain and cell reception and visibility points and access for emergency personnel. And then you're going to bring the right first aid kit, the right shelter. And one of the most important things is to be able to stay calm. All right, and we'll go back to travel and camp on durable surfaces. When we think about environmental ethics, the most durable surface is the one that we will damage the least when we use it. So we don't want to camp in a field of wildflowers if we can camp on a beach, a sandy surface. It's much more durable. We want to dispose of our waste properly. You can look at the suggestions for the area you're in, but typically we're going to bury our poop, our number 2, and then we're going to disperse our urine so that we don't have them build up. And basically, one of the things that I always use is dilution is the solution to pollution. So when we pee, we don't pee all of our urine in one spot. We're going to disperse it, and that will do less damage. We don't want to take things out of the backcountry when we're backpacking because that will be affecting the ecosystem. Animals may use things. They may use antlers. A squirrel may, or a mouse may utilize that marrow from that antler as nutrition. So we don't want to disrupt that. We want to minimize campfire impacts by using fire rings that are already there or using a fire blanket, even if the ecosystem is that sensitive. We also want to respect wildlife so that we're not scaring them away so that we can experience them more and that we're not interrupting their nesting. We're not interrupting anything else. We also, number 7, want other people to be able to enjoy what we're enjoying. So we want to be very careful not to be too loud, not to, wear too bright of colors and stuff like that. So I want to go through basic nutrition and then I'll finish up. But one, we need to drink more water. We're exerting ourselves. We need to drink minimum 3 or 4 liters a day. You can tell how hydrated you are by the color of your urine. We don't want it to be clear. That's overhydration. So we want it to be kind of a light yellow color. Also, it shouldn't smell. It shouldn't be very pungent. That will be a sign of dehydration. Dehydration affects every system in your body, which can make it harder for you to exert yourself. It can make you dizzy. It can make you less alert. So we want to be careful with that. Also, since we need all the nutrients, water aids in our digestion and in our ability to process those nutrients. We also want to consume more calories in the backcountry. So we want to make sure that we're eating more and we plan for the amount of exertion we have. Carbohydrates give us energy. Proteins help us heal, and fats do all those little things, lubrication, omega-3s. So we want to make sure that we get a balance. So read the labels. When we think about backcountry, a lot of pre-cooked, just rehydrated meals, that will get you started very easily. You don't have to be a chef or anything in the backcountry. But as you get better, then you can get into your own recipes, cooking dehydrated foods, making your own recipes so that you can get better at. There's a lot of websites for nutrition and backcountry recipes. And then I'm going to go ahead and really finish up. I just want to go over these slides. There are differences between backcountry and urban areas. It's response time, directions, difficulty of evacuation, and exposure. So we have to be much more careful. These 4 things you want to take a look at on your own, and you can get this information on the internet, or you can take a basic first aid class or a wilderness first aid class through the American Red Cross or so many other providers. But blisters doesn't seem like a very major thing, but that is one of the most common ailments in the backcountry, and it can really make a trip much less fun or even debilitate you to the point where you can't finish. Hot and cold related illnesses are extremely important because of our exposure to the elements. You can learn quickly about all of those online and familiarize yourself with their treatments. But the biggest thing is to reduce your exposure so those don't occur. And then the last one is ticks, insects, and poison ivy. You can plan your own preventative measures, whether it's clothing or if it's insect repellents, um, and things like that. Be able to identify poison ivy and poison oak or any other plants that are poisonous in the area that you're going. And then those all have basic treatments that you can learn. The last two slides are basic equipment for the first aid kit, and then a basic equipment list. So sorry that I had to finish kind of quickly, but I think a lot of the information on those last 5 slides is easy to find on the internet. And then if you had any questions, my email is gowen@murraystate.edu, and I would be happy to entertain any questions that you had if you weren't able to ask them at the end of this session. So thank you, and sorry that I took so long.
Mike, a fantastic program, just chock full of information. And once it makes me want to just keep reading and learning more. It was fantastic.
It's a lot. I'm sorry, but I didn't. It's dangerous out there, so I didn't want to do too little.
Oh, and speaking of that, could you discuss that? We talked about that earlier before we went on. There was some things about the danger. Go over that just a bit with us, please.
Yes, so a couple of things. One of the things, and we talked specifically about some places in Southern Illinois that are more dangerous. But if you're new to backpacking and you're new to hiking, it is my suggestion that you err on the side of precaution and you make sure that you know and that the information is available for the area you're going to. We were talking specifically about a place called Jackson Falls, and it's not a place that many people backpack, but a lot of people rock climb, and it's become a day hike destination. But it's not very well marked for a beginning hiker or for someone that's not familiar with the area or been there. So that makes it much more dangerous if you're not knowledgeable about those environments. So if you're in an alpine environment, for instance, you need to know about avalanche safety. If you're in a mountain setting, you'll need to know about scree and about rock slides. So when you choose a specific area, especially as a beginner, you not only need to know how to get there and where the trailhead is, but are there any specific risks to that area that are not just basic general backpacking risk? And so when we talk about Jackson Falls, it has several streams that turn into waterfalls that are extremely dangerous if you slip and fall. You'll go over the waterfall. And so you would think that you're on a trail and you might not, it's a trail, it's marked, I can hike, I can walk just like any normal person. But when you don't know that specific danger, you're not looking for it and you're not prepared for it, then it becomes a major risk. And so we really have to focus on the knowledge that we need as a beginner to make sure that we're safe, because the most important thing for me is that you're able to do it for the rest of your life. This is a lifetime activity. And so the more we minimize risk, the longer you're going to be able to enjoy it. And then you'll get better at it. And then you can take on more risks. So you kind of have to ease into it and make sure that you kind of acclimate yourself to risk identification and then risk management.
I noticed Dixie joined us today. Dixie, is there something you'd like to share? I know you and your husband are active hikers.
They're seasoned backpackers.
No, I did learn a lot today. Thanks, Mike, as experienced backpackers and hikers. And the part where you talk about knowing your trail markers is so important. Nathan and I have gotten lost on the North-South Trail because different paths cross and old roadbeds look like trails. So pay close attention, know what your trail marker looks like, and pay attention to that as you go. But great job, thank you. And I have a question about hammocks, but I can email or text you that later.
Yeah, I mean, I'm here if you want to ask it, but yeah, either or. And one thing I would say about trail markers, if you know the area, they may, in some of their information on their websites, they'll tell you how far apart they are.
Mm-hmm.
And I encourage beginners, if you get 100 yards past the last trail marker or 200 or 300 yards, go back and find that one and make sure that you went the right way. The further you are away from the last trail marker, the more lost you might quite possibly be. So when in doubt, go back and find that one before it gets away from you.
Mm-hmm. Yes. So yeah, with hammocks, we are considering using hammocks for sleeping to cut down on weight and gear. So instead of having to pack a tent, other than considering, obviously looking at the weather ahead of time and then deciding the best location with trees and I'm wondering what other considerations or suggestions do you have about or thoughts on using hammocks over tent?
One of the big things, if you're doing anything in cool or cold weather, you're going to want to buy an underquilt. And an underquilt attaches to the bottom of the hammock, and so it's actually underneath the hammock. But the reason for that is your sleeping bag doesn't work to insulate you as well in a hammock because you're smashing it down. And so the basic idea of a sleeping bag is what we call loft. And then so in cold weather, you'll take your sleeping bag out right away and you'll fluff it up and throw it in your tent. And so what that does is allows the materials to loft. And so that the more loft, the more the materials fluff out, that will keep air from getting through it. On a hammock, you're pressing that against the bottom of the hammock, and so it's not insulating as much. So you'll get much colder. So you'll want to get an underquilt that attaches to the hammock underneath, and so it's lofted up, and so it's much warmer that way. A couple of things about hammocks. You want to really know the area to make sure you have enough trees and trees in the right places. So either that or leave flexibility into your trip itinerary, because sometimes you may need much more than the I think they call them slap straps, the certain lengths that you have that come with hammocks. Or you might have to carry extra rope in case the trees are much further apart. Also, if you have any back issues or you sleep a certain way, if like side sleepers don't do very well overnight in hammocks, there are some new style of hammocks out that are much more flat. They pull much tighter, and so they're better for side sleepers, but I've not tried one personally. And that's really one of the reasons that I don't hammock backpack, is because I'm a side sleeper and hammocks just aren't conducive to side sleeping. They do have bug nets and they do also sell tent systems that go with them as well. So you can buy those or you can piece them together. You don't necessarily have to have one of their expensive rain flies that go with the hammock. Generally, with learning a couple of knots, you can also tie up a tarp above that. And so you might be able to use it for other things as well.
Yeah, a tarp is always on our list of things to pack. But yeah, I actually got a mosquito net to put over a hammock to try out, and it works great.
They do work well.
And I love hammocks because they can just carabiner or clip on to the bottom or side of your backpack, and
easy setup too. Yeah. No poles, no nothing. And the straps are so easy to change the lengths and everything. They really are convenient. I like them because I'm much more likely to nap in the afternoon.
Yes. Great for napping. But we haven't tried sleeping in them overnight yet. So
I've done it a couple of times, but like I said, I prefer the rigidity of the ground. But that's just, I'm a side sleeper, so that makes a difference.
Yeah. Yep. Well, thank you.
Yeah. Well, thanks for joining. Look forward to seeing you guys after the pandemic's all kind of toned down.
I know. We want to go rock climbing in Ferncliff with you and the kiddos.
I'll take you anytime. You just let me know when you're available. I would love to do that.
Thank you.
Fantastic presentation, Mike.
Awesome.
I mean, all kinds of things covered, just things I hadn't thought of, just very beneficial. It is recorded and it will be on our YouTube offering. So if you want to share it with others and if people want to go back to it and refer to it, the information will be available. Thank you so much.
Awesome. Yeah. Thank you for inviting me, Bobby. I appreciate it.